Hey guys, tonight we listen to a relaxing story. You get comfortable, take a moment to like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's begin the story. The carriage broke down half a mile before the villa. The driver refused to go further, muttering about the painter's house and crossing himself as the sea wind rose. I walked the rest of the way alone, boots crunching on gravel, the air heavy with salt and something metallic, like old blood beneath rain. Villa Ombra stood at the edge of the cliffs, its shutters rotted, its gates devoured by ivy. Once, it must have been beautiful. The marble steps were cracked, the fountain dry, the stone angels faceless from centuries of wind. I had come here as part of the Italian restoration project, a commission from the Municipal Museum in Genoa to recover the lost works of Lucien Vereni, a late 19th century painter whose art had become more legend than record. They said he painted light better than anyone alive. They also said he disappeared one night and no one ever found his body. Inside, the air was stale and thick. Dust floated in narrow shafts of sunlight from the broken windows, and the smell of linseed oil still clung to the walls. My footsteps echoed, soft and uneven. The gallery stretched long and narrow, and every inch of it was lined with canvases. Dozens of them. At first glance, they were only portraits, men and women, children, peasants, noblemen. Faces that should have belonged to strangers, but didn't feel that way. Their eyes were alive. The varnish had dulled with time, yet there was a wetness in their gaze, a strange immediacy that made me lower mine. When I turned away, I could feel them, the faint, ticklish sensation of being observed. I laughed once, nervously. Pareidolia, I whispered, the human instinct to find life where there is none. It was a defense, a small wall against what I felt crawling just behind reason. The ledger on the dusty desk listed each work by title and date. Many pages were smeared, some burnt, but one entry, written in trembling ink, caught my eye. Study in Shadow, completed 1891, subject M. Della Rocca, pigment, unknown. Pigment, unknown. I found it hanging at the far end of the gallery. The portrait was unlike the others. The paint was darker, richer, a black that seemed to drink the light from the room. The woman's face was half-turned, her expression serene, but the shadow behind her was wrong. It didn't follow her shape. It looked like someone else's silhouette, leaning close, almost whispering into her ear. As I stood there, a faint draft passed through the open window. The curtains moved. So did something else. A reflection, my own, caught in the glass of a nearby frame, blinked half a second too late. When I turned back to the portrait, I could have sworn the woman's eyes had shifted, just a fraction, toward me. That night, I set up my camp bed in the gallery, notebook open, lamp burning low. The house creaked, the wind howled against the shutters, and somewhere in the dark, a frame settled on its hook with a sound like a slow exhale. I wrote only one line before sleep overtook me. The paintings here do not rest. They wait. By the third day, the air inside the villa had grown heavier, thick with the scent of oil, mildew, and something faintly sweet like rotting fruit. I'd opened every window I could, but the wind from the cliffs only moaned through the corridors, carrying a cold that felt alive. Most of the canvases had survived surprisingly well. The varnish had yellowed, yes, but the colors beneath were vivid, too vivid. Flesh tones that still glowed, eyes that shimmered under dust, brush strokes that seemed to pulse with light when the lamp flickered. I told myself it was the play of shadow, the unstable flame. Yet every time I turned back to a portrait I just examined, something small, infinitesimal, had changed. A woman's necklace had shifted slightly on her collarbone. A child's mouth, once closed, now curved in the faintest hint of a smile. One man's pupils were no longer centered. They looked toward me. I began working by daylight only. But even then, the illusion held. When I leaned close with my magnifying lens, the paint beneath the cracks didn't look like paint. It had the soft translucence of skin. That night, I dreamed I was inside the gallery, surrounded by faces. They were whispering, breath warm against my ears. I couldn't understand the words, only the rhythm, like the sound of brushes on canvas. When I woke, there was condensation on the inside of my window and 5 faint fingerprints smeared across the glass. I told myself I'd touched it in my sleep. I told myself many things. At noon, I resumed my work. As I examined this study in shadow, again, the portrait of the woman with the strange silhouette, a faint shimmer ran across the surface. The air seemed to bend. For a heartbeat, her lips parted, just slightly. I stepped back so fast I knocked over the stool. The sound echoed through the hall like a gunshot. The painting, of course, was still. I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling my heart pound. "It's nothing," I whispered. "Just fatigue." But when I bent to pick up the stool, I saw it. A small, wet smear on the marble floor. A line of black pigment, glistening as though something inside the painting had begun to bleed through. That evening, I covered every portrait with a linen sheet. The rustle of fabric filled the room like whispers being smothered. I locked the gallery door and went upstairs to my makeshift quarters. I tried to read. I tried not to listen. But from below, through the floorboards, I heard it again. The faintest sound, a sigh, a slow drawn breath, as if 50 lungs inhaled in unison behind the shrouded frames. The next morning, I walked into the village. The air outside felt cleaner, sharper, as if distance itself could scrub away the suffocating stillness that lived inside that house. I found a church near the harbor, its bell tower leaning slightly toward the sea, its stones stained with salt. Inside, an old priest was sweeping the floor. His robes were threadbare, his movements slow, but when he saw me, he stopped. His eyes flicked to the dust on my boots, the smudges of paint on my fingers. "You've been up at the villa," he said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "I'm here to restore the Vereni collection." He leaned on his broom. "Then you've already heard them." I frowned. "Heard what?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to a pew and sat, gesturing for me to do the same. "Lucien Vereni was a genius," he began, but also troubled. "People say he painted with more than pigment. He believed light itself was alive, that the human soul could be captured in shadow. Toward the end, he stopped coming to Massachusetts. He stopped eating, and then came the boy. I felt a chill crawl up my arms. What boy? His apprentice. No one remembered his name. He was about 15, dark-haired, quiet. Came from Naples, they said. Lived with the painter for nearly a year. Then one winter morning, Vereni came down to the village alone. Pale, shaking. He told the baker that the boy had gone away. But when they searched the villa, They found the studio locked from the inside. He looked toward the altar, where a single candle guttered in its holder, and on the easel a painting, unfinished, a child's face. The eyes were missing. I swallowed hard. "You saw it yourself?" He nodded slowly. "Once, and once was enough." Outside, the church bell tolled. The sound rolled over the cliffs like a warning. The priest stood and began to light new candles. "They say Vereni's apprentice is still in that house," he murmured. "Not living, but not gone either. You'll know him when you feel the air move behind you, even when all the windows are closed." When I returned to the villa that evening, the gallery was silent. The linen sheets still covered the portraits. Nothing had shifted, but the moment I stepped inside the studio, a smaller room behind the main hall, one I hadn't noticed before, I smelled turpentine and iron. On the wall, hidden beneath a tarp, was another canvas, unfinished. A boy's face, faint and ghostly, painted in soft gray tones. His eyes were blank, unpainted ovals, waiting, and beside the easel, half buried in dust, a set of small handprints stained into the floorboards. They were too small to be Lucien Vereni's. That night, the wind rose again, carrying with it the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. I worked late in the studio, brushing away layers of grime from a small landscape, anything to distract myself from the faces under those linen sheets in the gallery. The air tasted of dust and salt, and the only light came from my lantern, a trembling circle that made the walls seem to breathe. I had begun to notice something strange in the corners of the room. Darker patches where the lamplight didn't seem to reach, shapes that lingered too long when I moved. Shadows were thicker here, denser, as if they had weight. Around midnight, I felt a shift in the air, a sudden stillness that made my hand stop mid-stroke. The flame in the lantern quivered, but didn't go out. Behind me, something moved, a faint rustle, like cloth brushing against a wall. When I turned, no one was there. Only my own shadow, stretched long and thin across the cracked plaster. I watched it for a moment, my pulse hammering. Then I lifted my hand. The shadow lifted too. But a second later, when I lowered my arm, the shadow did not. It stayed raised, a silhouette frozen in a gesture I no longer made. My breath caught. I took a step back, and for an instant, the shadow breathed. A ripple passed through it, slow and deliberate, like wind through smoke. The lamp flickered. When it steadied again, everything was normal. My shadow followed as it should. I told myself it had been the movement of the light, a trick of exhaustion. But then I saw it again, on the floor near the far wall. Another shadow, not mine. It belonged to no shape, no object. It was just there, standing, faintly human, the edges soft and wavering as though painted in wet ink. It seemed to be facing the canvas I'd been restoring. Slowly, I stepped closer. The air grew colder, the smell of turpentine sharper. When I reached the wall, the shadow dissolved, melting back into the darkness. That was when I noticed the corner of the landscape painting had changed. The horizon line was darker, the shape of a figure standing against the sunset, one I hadn't painted, one that hadn't been there before. I backed away, the lantern trembling in my hand. Some instinct deeper than thought, told me to look down. My shadow was still beside me on the floorboards. But it was wrong. Its head was tilted slightly in the opposite direction of mine. And as I stared, it began to smile. The key was hidden behind a cracked frame in the hallway. I hadn't been looking for it, It fell, almost deliberately, from the back of a painting when I moved it to dust the wall. Small, brass, and cold as ice. There was only one door in the villa that had never opened. It stood at the end of the upper corridor, its wood warped with age, its handle rusted. The air around it was colder than the rest of the house, the kind of cold that feels not like absence, but resistance. I passed it many times, always feeling something like pressure behind it, as though someone stood waiting on the other side, holding their breath. That night, I couldn't resist. The key fit perfectly. It turned with a low click, and the door groaned open a few inches, releasing a breath of stale air. The smell hit me first: paper, mold, and the faintest trace of iron. I lifted my lamp and stepped inside. It was a small chamber, barely larger than a pantry. The walls were covered floor to ceiling in sketches. Hundreds of them, pinned and layered, edges curling from moisture. Everyone was a portrait: charcoal, pencil, ink, faces of men, women, children. The villagers I'd seen in the square. The baker, the priest, even the boatman who had refused to drive me all the way up to the villa. Each sketch captured their likeness perfectly, but there was something else. Each face wore the same expression: a slack, vacant stare, the mouth just slightly open, as if mid-silent breath. My skin prickled. I traced one with my fingers, and the paper felt warm. I froze. Then I noticed faint writing beneath each drawing, a name followed by a date. The dates ran backward. The most recent sketch was from just 2 weeks before I arrived. The name beneath it was Elena Mora. She was the young woman who ran the small inn in the village, the one who'd offered me tea and warned me never to stay in the villa after sunset. My breath came shallow. I pulled the next few sketches from the wall, one after another, and behind them were more, layers upon layers, all the way down to the plaster. Near the back of the room, a single canvas rested against the wall, covered by a drape. I hesitated, then lifted it. It wasn't a painting. Not yet. Just an underdrawing. The faint outline of a woman's form, unfinished, but unmistakable. The shape of her face, the slope of her shoulders. It was me. Every muscle in my body went rigid. I backed away slowly, the lamp shaking in my hand, its flame dancing across the eyes of the sketched faces that seemed to follow me as I moved. When I reached the door, I heard it, a sound I'll never forget, the soft scrape of charcoal on paper, coming from the wall behind me. I turned just long enough to see a new line appearing on one of the sketches, dark and fresh, the outline of a figure standing in the doorway. Me. The stranger arrived just after dawn. I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel path long before the knock. No one ever came here, not from the village, not from the museum, so the sound alone was enough to set my nerves alight. When I opened the door, he was standing there in a long black coat, the sea wind snapping its edges like wings. His hat cast a deep shadow over his face, but I could see his eyes, pale gray and far too calm. "You must be the restorer," he said. His Italian was formal, old-fashioned, the kind of speech that belonged in another century. "You found them, haven't you? The Vereni portraits." I didn't invite him in, but he stepped over the threshold anyway, unbothered by my hesitation. The smell of the villa, oil, mildew, something faintly sweet, didn't seem to disturb him. If anything, he breathed it in like perfume. He walked straight toward the covered canvases in the gallery. His hand hovered over one, tracing the air above the linen as though he could feel what lay beneath. "They're still alive," he murmured. "I can hear them." I tried to keep my voice steady. "You mistaken, Signore. They're paintings. Nothing more." He smiled faintly. "So you think?" Then he reached into his coat and drew out a thin envelope. Crisp, new, impossibly clean against the dust of the room. "I'll pay you for one," he said. "Whichever you choose. But don't clean it. Don't restore it. And whatever you do—" He turned to look at me fully now, his expression sharp as a blade. "Never look behind the varnish." Something in the way he said it made the back of my throat go dry. "What's behind it?" I asked. "Everything that shouldn't have been seen." He pressed the envelope into my hand. It was heavier than paper should be. Coins, perhaps, or something else metallic, warm, as though it had been held close to skin. When I looked up again, he was already walking toward the door. "You've stayed here too long," he said without turning. The painter was not the only one who vanished. Then he was gone. The silence that followed felt alive. I didn't open the envelope. I left it on the desk, staring at it while the light changed across the room. When I finally tore it open, expecting money, a small square of darkened glass slid out. On its surface, beneath years of grime, something shimmered. A reflection, faint but unmistakable. My own face staring back at me. But my reflection was smiling. And I wasn't. The morning after the stranger's visit, I woke to the smell of oil and iron. It wasn't coming from my workspace. It came from beneath the gallery door, seeping into the corridor like smoke. The air inside was colder than before. The linen sheets that covered the paintings fluttered slightly, though the windows were shut tight. Every sound felt swallowed by the house. Even my footsteps seemed muted, as if the walls were listening. I decided to return to my work, to occupy my hands before my thoughts could unravel further. The painting I chose was one of the oldest, a portrait of a woman in a red shawl, her face turned towards something unseen beyond the frame. The varnish had darkened almost to amber. It would take hours to clean properly. I began carefully, swabbing the surface with a solvent-soaked cloth. The smell of it mingled with something else, faint but growing stronger, a copper tang I recognized instantly. Blood. At first, I thought I cut my hand. I checked. No wound, no red. But when I looked back at the painting, the edge of the cloth was stained dark. I touched the corner of the canvas. My fingers came away wet. A drop of crimson slid down the woman's cheek. Slow, deliberate, too thick to be paint. It hung for a moment at her chin before falling onto the frame. I froze. The color was too vivid. It pooled on the floor, forming a perfect circle before spreading into the cracks of the old marble. My breath caught in my chest, shallow and ragged. I could feel the villa holding its breath with me. Then came the whisper, soft at first, the hiss of air escaping between teeth, then clearer, as though someone stood just behind my ear. "Don't clean us." I spun around, lamp raised. The gallery was empty. The covered portrait stood silent, unmoving. But as I watched, the fabric over them began to shift, not from wind, but from within, slow undulations like breathing. I backed toward the door, but the whisper came again, now more voices, layered and urgent, threading through the dark. We were light. He took our breath. Behind a varnish, we wait. Something in me snapped. I tore the linen from one of the paintings. A man's portrait, mid-aged, eyes like smudged coals. For an instant, his lips parted, and the whispering stopped. The silence was worse. Thick, expectant. I stumbled back, and the lantern tipped, its flame brushing the wet floor. A hiss, then the red streaks shimmered in the light. Not blood, not exactly, but something alive. The stains pulsed faintly, as if responding to the rhythm of my heartbeat. I ran, out of the gallery, up the staircase, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the farthest room at the end of the hall. But even there, through the old wood, through the cold stone, I could still hear it. A faint scratching sound, brush bristles dragging across canvas. And beneath it, a voice I recognized now, deep, calm, almost tender. Lucien Vereni, whispering to his model. Hold still. The light is perfect. For 3 nights, I didn't go back to the gallery. I tried to sleep in the attic, away from the smell of oil and the soft hiss of whispers that never quite faded. But the house didn't let me rest. It creaked inside, doors trembled as if someone walked past them, and sometimes, just at the edge of hearing, a brush would drag across canvas, slow and steady, from somewhere below. On the 4th morning, I found muddy footprints in the hallway. Bare feet. The prints led from the gallery door to the studio, then vanished at the threshold, as though whoever left them had stepped directly into the wall. I told myself I would leave that day. I packed my tools, my journal, the little lamp that had become my only comfort. But when I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw the door to the gallery was open. The key, which I always kept in my pocket, lay on the floor beside it. Something had unlocked it from the inside. I should have run. I should have gone to the village, to the priest, to anyone. But curiosity, that cruel and faithful voice, pulled me forward. I stepped into the gallery once more. Every linen sheet had been torn away. The portraits were bare, exposed, and changed. Faces that had once looked passive now turned outward, alert, aware. Their gazes followed me in perfect unison. My throat went dry. I forced myself toward the far end of the hall, to this study in shadow, the one that had haunted me from the first day. But it wasn't the same painting anymore. The woman's figure was gone. The background, once soft and dark, now shimmered with depth, like the surface of still water. And in that depth, faint at first, then clearer, a new image had formed. A man's face, Lucien Vereni. I knew it from the few photographs that existed. The sharp jaw, the narrow mouth, the eyes that seemed always to be looking at something just beyond the frame. But here, his expression was different. He was smiling, not the gentle, studied smile of an artist posing for a portrait. It was wrong, alive, amused. Lucien, I whispered before I could stop myself. The surface of the painting rippled, ever so slightly, as if stirred by breath. His smile widened. I stumbled back, knocking into a pedestal. My lamp wavered, and its flame threw light across the other portraits. One by one, the figures inside them began to change, eyes flicking toward me, lips twitching at the corners. And then, from the canvas before me, came a voice. Smooth, familiar, the same one that had whispered through my dreams. You've done well, it said. You've set them free. I shook my head, words caught somewhere between fear and denial. You're dead. A low laugh echoed through the room, vibrating through the frames, the walls, the floor beneath my feet. Not dead, the voice said. Preserved. The paint on the canvas began to run, colors bleeding downward, reshaping into something fluid, breathing. His eyes moved, blinked. I turned to flee, but the door had shut. The whisper rose again, a chorus now, dozens of voices from every painting, murmuring, pleading, sighing in a single rhythm. And beneath it all, Lucien's voice, warm, close, almost touching my ear. "You came to restore me," he said, "and you have." The last thing I saw before the lantern went out was his hand, the painted hand, pressing against the inside of the canvas, fingers pushing through, the varnish cracking like old glass. Reaching toward me, the priest had warned me never to speak his name again. Not Lucien Vereni, not even the painter. But silence only fed the obsession. I couldn't stop thinking about how his works breathe, how the faces inside them shifted ever so slightly when the moonlight touched their varnish. I returned to the villa one last time. It felt different now, not abandoned but occupied. The air was heavy, as if the walls themselves were awake. I went straight to the basement studio, where the dust was thickest and the scent of turpentine hung like a ghost. There, buried beneath torn sketches and broken frames, I found a small wooden chest bound by iron clasps. Inside were dozens of letters, correspondence between Lucien and someone who called themselves the Broker of Shadows. They spoke of an ancient technique older than paint itself. Pigment made not from minerals or oils, but from the burnt remains of a person's shadow, a ritual that could capture the living essence of whoever stood before the canvas. Lucien hadn't just painted people, he had imprisoned them. Each commission, each portrait was a transaction, beauty traded for breath, stillness for eternity. The letters detailed every step. The precise hour when the subject's shadow was longest, the mixture of black ash and animal fat, the Latin invocation whispered as the paint dried. I read on, my hands shaking. The final letter was from the broker himself, congratulating Lucien on perfecting the process. It ended with a single warning: never bind your own shadow. My candle flickered, guttering low. I looked around the room. The walls were lined with sketches, hundreds of them, each one faintly luminous in the dark. When the flame finally died, the drawings didn't fade. They glowed, and then I saw it, my own silhouette cast on the far wall. But I wasn't moving, and it was. Slowly, it turned its head toward me. I stumbled back, heart pounding, as the sketches began to peel off the plaster, drifting in the air like ash. Faces emerged from the paper, half finished, gasping, whispering my name. I fled up the stairs, clutching the last of the letters. At the top, I dared one final glance behind me. My shadow lingered in the doorway, perfectly still, watching me. And as I stepped into the moonlight outside, I saw something that froze me completely. I cast no shadow at all. The night was silent when I began the last portrait. The villa's windows were boarded shut, but still the wind found its way through the cracks, a low, steady moan that rose and fell like a sleeping breath. Every brush, every pigment, every tool on the table belonged to him, Lucien Vereni, the painter who had trapped souls in color. The canvas before me was already prepared, its surface shimmering faintly even in darkness. The moment I touched it, the bristles dragged as though against skin, not linen. I didn't remember mixing the paint, yet the jars were full, one black as midnight, one red like old wine, and one colorless, though it caught the lamplight like water trembling on glass. I told myself I was only finishing what he started. The others, the portraits that breathed, the sketches that whispered, needed closure. Maybe completing his final work would end whatever bound this place. But as I painted, the air thickened, and the candle's flame stretched long and thin. My hand moved faster than my thoughts, guided by something unseen. The face forming on the canvas wasn't Lucien's. It was mine. The brush trembled in my grip, yet the strokes kept flowing, deliberate, perfect, inevitable. I wanted to stop, but my arm refused. Every shadow I laid down pulsed like a heartbeat. The lips on the portrait parted slightly, as if about to speak. And then it did. "Almost done," it whispered. The voice was mine. I stumbled back, the chair crashing behind me. My reflection in the varnished surface of the easel flickered, not in sync with me anymore. It blinked when I didn't. The smell of iron filled the room. My hands were slick. I looked down, red paint dripping from my fingertips, though I hadn't dipped the brush in any. On the canvas, my painted self was smiling. Its eyes were bright, alive. Too alive. I turned toward the mirror propped against the far wall. My face stared back, pale, hollow, the faintest shimmer rippling through it like heat on glass. And then, slowly, the reflection began to fade. First the eyes, then the mouth, then everything. I screamed, but no sound came out. The glass was empty now. Only the room behind me reflected. When I looked back at the canvas, my painted self had stepped forward, just slightly, enough to leave a faint, wet footprint on the floorboards. The brush slipped from my hand. I reached for the door, but there was nothing to grab. Only the cold frame of the mirror, smooth and endless. Inside the glass, the portrait smiled again. Its hand lifted, mirroring my terror perfectly. And then it whispered, almost kindly, "You're finished." The next morning, the villa was silent. Only a single painting rested on the easel. A woman mid-brushstroke, her eyes wide with realization. No one ever found her body. But on clear nights, when the moonlight hits the gallery walls, a faint reflection appears in the glass. It moves just enough to remind the viewer that somewhere, within the varnish, she's still painting. They say the villa is empty now. The shutters nailed, the doors chained, the walls damp with salt and time. But sometimes, when the fog rolls down from the hills and the sea breathes heavy against the cliffs, a light flickers behind the boarded windows, soft, golden, rhythmic, as if a brush moves across canvas once more. I returned only once. Years later, the authorities had long since sealed the place, calling it unsafe, but curiosity is a disease I never learned to cure. I carried no lantern this time, only the letter I'd found. Lucien Vereni's final words, written in his own hand. Art is not creation, it is transfer. What is taken must replace what is lost. The words made sense now. Every portrait was a vessel, one life exchanged for another. Every painting in that cursed gallery wasn't merely art. It was an archive of souls. When I stepped inside, the air was still and dry. Dust floated in the moonlight like slow snow. The paintings lined the walls, all draped in sheets, as if asleep. But beneath the fabric, I could hear faint breathing, dozens of soft, uneven rhythms as though the room itself inhaled. In the center stood the easel. My easel. The last portrait rested on it, uncovered. The paint hadn't dried, even after all these years. The woman in the picture looked peaceful now, her eyes no longer wide in terror, but calm, resigned. I reached out to touch the frame, and my fingertips brushed the surface, warm, almost alive. Behind me, the whispers began again. First one, then many. 100 voices murmuring from the walls. They weren't calling my name this time. They were pleading. "Don't look," one said. "Leave it," said another. But curiosity always wins. I tilted the canvas toward the light. Beneath the outer paint, faint outlines began to appear, others trapped beneath the layers. Men, women, children, entire lives hidden within the varnish, screaming silently beneath her face. The red pigment shimmered like blood under glass. The surface rippled, and for a heartbeat, the woman in the portrait blinked. I stumbled back. My own reflection stared from the window pane, pale, terrified, and behind it, another figure moved. A man's outline, familiar, with a brush in hand. Lucien Vereni. He was smiling. The candlelight swayed, and for a moment, I saw it all. Hundreds of figures behind him, all painted souls, all alive inside their frames. The gallery was no longer abandoned. It was full. Then, just as quickly, the light died. When I came to, dawn had broken. The portraits were gone. The walls were bare. Only one painting remained. The same easel, the same figure. But this time, there were two people inside the frame. The woman and a man standing behind her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. The faces were identical to ours. They say that if you visit the cliffs at night, you can still hear the sea whispering beneath the villa and see faint shapes moving in the windows. Not ghosts, not exactly, just shadows, still trying to find their way back to light. And somewhere inside, two figures stand before a canvas that never dries.